Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. My name is Delia Mogahed, and I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. First, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this webinar today. And thank you to all the supporters who make the American Muslim poll, as well as everything we do, possible. For those of you who may not know, ISPU is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and there are so many ways that you can join us for our celebration and help us celebrate. Please visit www.ispu.org/20 years for more information. Today's webinar is the third in a monthly series of webinars diving deep into new research findings from the American Muslim Poll 2022. Since 2016, ISPU's American Muslim Poll has captured a snapshot of American Muslim experiences in all their diversity, as well as tracked trends over time. This nationally representative survey provides researchers, policymakers, educators, journalists, and the public insights and analysis into the attitudes and policy preferences of American Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, white evangelicals, as well as non-affiliated Americans, and the general public at large. This allows readers to understand American Muslim perspectives within the context of their nation's faith landscape, not just as an isolated specimen. It is the only poll of its kind. This publication serves both to educate the wider society on their Muslim neighbors, but also to inform Muslims themselves about their strengths and struggles. Today's conversation is just one of the many topics covered. If you missed our first two webinars, you can find them in their totality free to view on our YouTube channel. An important reminder before we get started, ISPU is a nonpartisan research and education organization. Our mission is to provide objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. So what we're going to do first is I will present the research that we're going to be discussing today from the American Muslim Poll, and then we'll bring on a panel of thought leaders to discuss the results. So please bear with me as I share my screen. Okay. You can join the conversation and post about this topic as you're watching on Facebook, on Twitter, or Instagram, and you can use our handles. Okay, let me fix the way I'm sharing here. Hold on. Okay. All right. So what we'll talk about today is a little bit about the American Muslim Poll. Then I'll dive into key findings about this specific topic of civic engagement, and then we'll go into our panel discussion. So again, the American Muslim Poll is a nationally representative survey of Muslims, Jews, Protestants, and within that group, white evangelicals is a specific group, Catholics and non-affiliated Americans. The topics include demographics, religious discrimination and Islamophobia, civic engagement, voter suppression, hot button issues, and more. Briefly about the methodology, we conduct our polls through a vendor called SSRS, They are the same vendor that conducts polls for CNN, CBS, ABC, the Washington Post, and many other organizations. Sampling and weighting is led by Dr. Jonathan Best, their Vice President for Advanced Scientific Methods, who is a longtime member and presenter at APOR and a member of the American Statistical Association. All participants in our polling are given identical surveys. So it is a nationally representative sample of Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, non-affiliated Americans, and the sample sizes are listed in the slide. Our survey fielding period this year was February 22nd to March 21st. And you can read much more about it at ispu.org/poll. We also have a phenomenal panel of advisors on our poll, really some of the top minds in both subject matter as well as polling minorities and Muslims specifically. So key findings overview. American Muslims are the most likely to be optimistic about the direction of the country. They're also among the most likely to approve of President Biden. And the good news is that their voter registration continues to climb. And this year we found no inshallah voters. And I'll tell you more about what that means. American Muslims are the most likely, more likely than any other faith group to face obstacles to casting their vote. And those obstacles include long wait times, and that's the most often cited obstacle to voting. For Muslims, facing obstacles to voting is actually associated with a greater intention to vote, not less. So let's dig into the details. Muslims are the most likely to be satisfied with the direction of the country, with 48% of Muslims satisfied with the direction of the country. You can compare that to 4% of white evangelicals as the lowest. It's interesting that this has been a trend every time we measure it. Muslims are always much more optimistic than many other groups, even under Trump, which was very surprising. And it just suggests that there's perhaps a sense that the direction of the country is more than just a single president and just a general optimism among Muslims about the future. Now, it's not, it's not uniform across the Muslim community. Muslims who identify as white are most likely to be satisfied with the direction of the country, whereas Arabs or Muslims who identify as Arab are the least likely to be satisfied. So here, 40% of Muslims who identify as Black are satisfied, whereas almost 60% are dissatisfied. And it's reversed here for Muslims who identify as white. Asians, it's about half and half, and for Arabs, it's really a lot more similar to Black Muslims, although Arab Muslims are the most negative. Now, before I go further, I will preempt maybe some questions by explaining what is a white Muslim, because that's often a topic of great curiosity. So white Muslims are people who simply identify as white as their racial group when asked how they identify in terms of race. And they do have the option to choose Arab. So these are not Arabs. For the vast majority, for almost all of them, they are not Arabs because Arab is an option, and people who are Arab do choose that as their identification. White Muslims would be Bosnians, Turkish people, Iranians, Chechens. The vast majority of them are not white converts, okay? So white converts are only about 15% of, quote, white Muslims. So these are mostly people who, whose heritage is from outside the United States. So where has this satisfaction with the direction of the country been and where is it going? As I mentioned, Muslims do tend to be the most positive, and the climax of their positivity about the direction of the country was back in 2016 when Obama was still president, with 63% being satisfied with the direction of the country. Now, it did drop during the Trump years, but even then, even in 2017, when he was about to take office, or had just taken office, since it was in January of 2017 that we took this poll, it was still higher than other groups. And in 2018, they were really about the same as Jews and the general public. But it's interesting that Muslims are always more positive than Jewish Americans, despite the fact that Trump was not favored by either group. Here in 2019, again, Muslims more positive, and now by far the most positive. Muslims and Jews and Catholics are more likely than others to approve of President Biden. And again, Muslims and Jews the most positive. They're statistically similar here, 60% and 57%, with the least positive being white evangelicals. But the president does enjoy high approval ratings in the community. Now, again, Muslims are diverse people, and across racial groups, it's not uniform. So Arab Muslims are the least likely, less likely than other Muslims to approve of President Biden's performance, with only 39%, compared to white Muslims, 73%. But he enjoys approval ratings in the majorities among Black and Asian Muslims as well, with Arab Muslims the only group that is below a majority. It's interesting that Muslim and Jewish presidential approval tracks closely, just generally. So both very positive during the Obama years, both dipping during the Trump years, and then going back up during the Biden years. This is the one time when Muslims are more negative, though. Despite it, it's really interesting that their presidential approval really dipped in 2018, 2019, 13 and 16% lower than anyone else. Yet they were still more positive than others, comparatively at least, about the direction of the country, suggesting that they do see the direction of the country as being more than just who's in the White House. Now, some good news. Muslim voter registration on par with Protestants, non-affiliated, and the general public. This was not always the case. So this is a new thing that is something I think to celebrate, that Muslims have caught up with other groups. And you can see the climb is steady. Muslim voter registration climbs steadily since 2016. It was only 60% in 2016. In 2022, it's all the way up to 81% of eligible Muslims actually being registered to vote. Again, I want to emphasize, a lot of people ask, is this among every Muslim in America, including non-citizens? No, you have to be eligible to vote to get the question if you're registered. So it's the percentage of eligible voters who are registered to vote. The bad news, though, is that Muslims are more likely than any other group to face obstacles to voting. And the interesting thing is that despite that, voter registration has actually climbed, but Muslims are at least twice as likely as any other group, roughly, to say that they have experienced some kind of obstacle when trying to cast their ballot in the past 4 years. Now, who is most likely among Muslims to have had this experience? The first is younger Muslims are the most likely to report facing obstacles to voting. So 55% of 18 to 29-year-olds in the Muslim community said that they have faced some kind of obstacle to voting. Compared to the same age cohort in the general public, it's only 29%. So again, almost twice as likely as their generational peers to have faced obstacles to voting. The same is the case even for 30 to 49-year-olds. The only group where it's not very common to have faced obstacles is people who are 50 years and above. Interestingly, Muslims who identify as white are the most likely to report facing obstacles to voting. And this is where they veer away from their racial peers in the general public, where only 15% of whites in the general public say that they've faced obstacles to voting, compared to 31% of Black Americans overall and 28% of Hispanic Americans. It's still interesting that Muslims are basically on par, aside from white Muslims, but everyone else, Black, Asian, and Arab Muslims, are roughly on par with Black and Hispanic people in the general public. So Black, Asian, and Arab Muslims are roughly on par with Black and Hispanic non-Muslims, or Black and Hispanic people, Americans in the general public, to say that they have experienced some kind of obstacle to voting. But there's this huge difference among white Muslims, white identifying Muslims. And this is something that we hope to understand better and study, because there's over and over, we sort of see these unique responses among white Muslims that we're not always sure where they're coming from. So this is something that we will be digging more into using qualitative research in the future. So what is that obstacle? What is this huge, in what form do these obstacles happen? The most frequent response to that question is long wait times, that your polling stations have been closed, for example, and your polling station has long wait times. Other obstacles include shortened hours at the polling station, nearby polling station shut down, which is very similar to long wait times. So those even could possibly be combined. Cumbersome voter ID requirements, that's 14%. There's also language barriers among 13%, and 12% say intimidation. So what was really interesting, though, is that facing obstacles to voting, we didn't expect this at all, was one of the predictors of intending to vote. So there were three things that came out in the analysis. Greater likelihood of intending to vote among Muslims was associated with facing obstacles to voting, being born in the US, and being 50 years old or higher. Now, being born in the US, being older, that's pretty unsurprising, right? That tends to be the case. Immigrants just generally in the world, in the general public even, are slightly less likely to be to intend to vote than people born in the US. Older people are more likely to intend to vote than younger people. But where we were really surprised is the fact that facing obstacles to voting actually came out as a predictor, as associated with intending to vote. So recommendations. And these are recommendations for Muslim community leaders primarily. Direct get out the vote messaging toward Muslim women and young people, as they are less likely to plan to vote in the midterm election. Those were the two groups that were the least likely to say that they intended to vote. Educate American Muslim voters about how to respond when facing obstacles to voting, and recognize, and this is something that we've already talked about, internalized Islamophobia as a major challenge facing young Muslims. And now I will introduce our panel discussion. Okay, everyone could come on camera and I will go ahead and introduce you. Start with Edward Ahmed Mitchell, who is an attorney and former journalist who serves as the Deputy Director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, the largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. And you can read more about Edward in the chat. I will not be able to read all of his accolades or for anyone. I'll just be introducing their name and affiliation. Next, I'd like to introduce Muhammad Gula. He is the National Organizing Director and Executive Director of Engage Virginia chapter. We also will have Ishraq, and he is the Organizing Director at Empower Change. And last but not least, Dr. Dalara Saeed, who is the President of the Muslim Civic Coalition. Thank you all so much for joining us and lending your expertise to this topic. Edward, I'm going to start with you. As we just saw and discussed, American Muslims, that our poll found that American Muslims are facing many challenges and obstacles when they go to cast their vote, their ballot. What does that mean for American Muslim civil rights?
Thank you, Dolly, and thank you to ISPU for hosting this event, for welcoming us, and for conducting this poll. I want to start by just noting why the work you do is so important. You know, there are all sorts of assumptions made about what American Muslims think and believe, and your polling is very important to journalists, to policymakers, and to civil rights groups. So we really understand what is going on in the community, what are their views, what are the challenges they're facing, so we can help address and talk about those issues intelligently. So a big thank you to ISPU for the work that you do. And it's a pleasure to be here with Empower Change, Engage, and the Muslim Civic Coalition of Illinois. So Jazakallah khairan. As to the issue at hand, voting restrictions, threats to the right to vote, and what that means for civil rights. Let me start by stating the obvious, that if Muslims or any other community are not able to vote, not able to have an impact on who is being elected to public office, then there's a significant chance that their views and their concerns will not be heard in Congress, in the state legislature, in the governor's office, right? So it's just obvious, right? If you are not voting or if you're not able to vote, then obviously the things you care about may not be addressed when it comes time to start making policy. So that's the concern. Now, to dive into the numbers that you all found and shared, I'm actually surprised by a few things and not surprised by other things. So first and foremost, some of the challenges that Muslim voters are facing, are challenges that everyone is facing as a result of voting restrictions that have been put in place since the 2020 election, as opposed and some that were existing before that. So you've had polling places shut down that has created these very long lines in metropolitan areas. You have had voter ID laws that have been passed that can be not difficult for many people, but difficult for people who are poor or senior citizens, may not have a government ID readily available or able to get one easily. And then you've got some silly, just outright silly and nefarious things. For example, in Georgia, where I'm based, our state legislature passed a law saying that you cannot hand out food and water to someone waiting in line to vote, right? This is, it's just a silly, clearly nefarious thing designed to make it difficult for people to stay in line to vote. And then, as noted in your poll, language barriers, right? One of the things that we're always concerned about when it comes to these signature match laws that require, for example, someone submitting a mail-in ballot, their signature to be matched up with whatever signature they signed on their driver's license 5, 10, 20 years ago. That is very, very concerning and very dangerous. It's really easy for someone to make a mistake. If you're a clerk and not a handwriting expert and you look at someone's signature and compare it, that's not a scientific method of verifying someone's identification. It's no reason to deprive someone of their right to vote. And, Muslim Americans, many of us, many people speak different languages originally, might have different ways of writing, and may not even write their name in a way that a clerk can understand. That could really set up an opportunity for someone to throw out a vote. So these are all some of the obstacles that we know about. And I think your poll confirms those issues threaten the public in general. And in particular, some of those things threaten Muslim Americans who many of us live in metropolitan areas, big cities. We have unique names, and of course, we are visibly Muslim. And that, of course, raises the risk of being intimidated or threatened at the polls by these hostile observers who can go in and observe voting now. And of course, that was noted in your poll as well. Now, that's all concerning, but there are things that can be done about all these things. So number one, all these problems that you identified can be addressed by preparing to vote in advance, right? By making a plan and calling on civil rights groups and political groups for help to make sure that you're able to vote, right? If these laws have been passed and they're not being defeated yet by the court, then the key thing is you've got to get ready early, make a plan, and not just show up on election day hoping everything goes well. You've got to make a plan to vote and execute that plan in advance. It's sad it has to be that way, but that's what we're dealing with right now. The other thing to note is that, when you show up to vote, if something happens there, that's not the end of the road. You could always call someone for help, Engage, CAIR, anyone else who can then try to help and make sure you're able to get your vote counted that day. The key thing that we don't want to happen, Dolly, that we're concerned about is we don't want people to see all these potential obstacles and go, well, I don't want to vote at all, right? It's too much trouble. I'm just one person. It won't make that big of a difference. That's the real fear, is that these obstacles can lead people just to say, I'm not going to worry about it. It's just a congressional election. I'll move on. That's the real fear that I have. And I think your poll indicates, thankfully, that people who face obstacles are even more intent on voting, right? And that's good news. And I suspect that's number one, because people who are targeted with voter restriction laws tend to be minority groups, and they know that they've got to fight to uphold their vote. And when they feel their votes are being targeted, that makes them even more intent on voting. The one thing I'll say before I close is that the poll result indicating that white Muslims reported that they feared or faced the most voter restrictions, I am somewhat puzzled by that, to be frank, because African Americans in general tend to be the voters who are most directly targeted and are the real target of many of these laws. So I'd love to dive more into those numbers, because there might be a problem there that white Muslims are experiencing that we haven't thought of, especially if many of these individuals, that are Bosnian or Turkish or of other descent. So I think, again, that's why ISPU's polls are so important, because they give us insight to things that we may not have even thought of. So short answer to the question is, if people can't vote, their voice is not going to be heard in the office of the person being elected. And that's why it's so important that we're aware of these obstacles, that we fight them legally, and we make a plan to overcome them when we are voting, inshallah. So again, thank you, ISPU, for doing this and for having me, and I look forward to the discussion, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Edward. And yes, I, like you, was puzzled by those numbers as well regarding white Muslims, which is why we need more research and do plan to conduct it shortly, just trying to understand what does that mean. I'm now going to turn to Ahmed. Between 2016 and 2022, the gap between American Muslims who are intent on voting, so have the intention to vote, but were not registered, disappeared completely, meaning anyone who said, I intend to vote in the next election, was also registered to vote. Now, what's left over are people who are eligible to vote, not intending to vote, and not registered. So when we say inshallah voters, what we meant were people who say, yes, I'll vote in the next election, but no, I'm not registered. That's the inshallah voter. That group is gone now. Anyone who wants to vote or intending to vote is actually able to vote. They've registered themselves. But what about this nearly 15% of Muslims, actually not 15% of Muslims, sorry, now 81% of Muslims are registered. There's another roughly 19% who are eligible to be registered, are eligible to vote, but are not registered and don't want to vote, are actually rejecting their right, basically. What are your thoughts about this group, and where's the future of growing Muslim American political participation?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Sister Dalia. And thank you, of course, to ISPU for hosting this. And that poses a very important question, especially in regards to the inshallah voters. And really, before looking into what we can do to activate those voters, I think that it's always important for us to also name our successes of what we've done so well as a community the past 5 years. And when we look at the past 5 years, at least within what we've kind of seen as an organization, we really saw a shift in three things. The first thing was that we saw the Muslim community come together to work towards solving that lack of representation and that lack of voice that we otherwise didn't see much of. So we saw over, and I believe CAIR and Jetpack and others had worked towards putting this list together, but we saw over 500 American Muslims run for office in just the past 5 years, or at least at a minimum the past three. Folks like Abdullah Sayed, Medina Wilson Anton, our very own Adhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, Bashir Jones, people who also ran at local elections like Buta Bibaraj as a Commonwealth attorney out of Virginia, and Abrar Omesh, who's a school board member. And then we also saw outspoken allies who grew, like Andy Levin, Marie Newman, Cori Bush, Ayanna Pressley, Jerry Connolly. And it wasn't even just candidates that have kind of come out. We had campaign staff like Fayez as Bernie manager's campaign manager, and judges and administration appointments like we've never seen. But we also saw organizers like our sister Linda Sarsour, who came out and organized one of the largest mobilizations in modern day history. And I think equally as important, we saw investment in our institutional capacities. We saw organizations like Polygon, Jetpack, our own organization at Engage, where we grew from one chapter to 6 chapters. And I would argue one of the most important pieces is that we also saw a shift in philanthropy, where folks like Ford, MacArthur, Proteus, Pillars, El Hibri, a Muslim Voter Project, all who came in, who invested year after year on us being able, and as a Muslim community, being able to continue to invest in capacity and institutional capacity that we felt was extremely important for us to do the activities that need to get done to close that, inshallah, voter gap. But we also saw a shift in social norms and social obligation. We saw that conversations in our mosques had turned from schools, or in our mosques, schools, and community centers, had shifted from talking about voting in a way that was like considered haram to now being considered an amana, a social responsibility. And we're seeing ourselves in our institutions hosting candidate forums, town halls, post-Jumu'ah appeals by elected officials. I know myself growing up at the masjid, I don't remember ever seeing an elected official come to the masjid and speak to us. I don't even remember seeing Muslim organizations having voter registration tables at masajid either. And so when we start to talk about closing that further gap, as you mentioned, that 19%, I do think that it's important that we see where we are, where we've been. And then as we move forward, as we're going door to door, as we're doing GOTV, I know right now we're in like 3 weeks left where we're like, okay, we have to increase our Muslim voter turnout. We have to look at these folks who are not wanting to turn out, where they may express a very real problem that we actually see not just in the Muslim community, but across the nation, where there's this sense of voter apathy, where the interest of wanting to be engaged is not there. And the reality of it is that there are some very real issues and obstacles for folks that I know my brother Edward had mentioned, very real obstacles that sometimes voting and being politically engaged can be considered a privilege, because sometimes our folks and members of the community don't have the privilege to really think about voting while they're still struggling and thinking about getting being able to have clean water or have food security or whatever it may be. So those of us who are able to engage are still fighting and uplifting them. But then you'll also see this lack of the word I like to use is political efficacy, where there is this ideal, and we hear this very often in the Muslim community, where there is a lack, where the person does not believe that being politically engaged will create the social change or will be able to impact the political kind of outcomes that they would like to see. And a lot of that happens just over time, where they voted once, they voted twice, they've elected this person and that person, and the campaign promises that were guaranteed to them just haven't happened. And so it does become a conversation around what is the outcome that we're trying to continue to move forward with. But in order for us to have those types of conversations everything else also has to fall in line, meaning we have to continue to invest in representation. We have to continue to invest in our relationships with philanthropy and with donors, and shifting the conversation around, hey, there was a certain time period where we did need to ensure that a lot of our organizations need to have this arm of outreach and need to have this arm of being able to go door to door, call phone to phone or text in order for us to really uplift those that are most impacted. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, you brought up some really important points. And first of all, one thing we have seen in our research is that when people don't intend to vote and we ask them why, you're absolutely right. It is about apathy. It's about not believing their vote will really make a difference, or saying that none of their topics or none of their policy priorities are represented in any option. So why are they going to vote if no one is actually speaking to them? The other thing that we noticed is that almost no one is justifying their reluctance to vote by saying it's haram. That argument has largely disappeared. And now it's really about fighting apathy. So thank you for highlighting those important points. And thank you for taking stock of the accomplishments, which are phenomenal over the past 5 years, the entire community coming together to close that gap of people intending to vote and people actually being registered. Ishraq, I'm going to come to you next. American Muslims are all over the map in terms of their views on different social and political topics. As a Muslim digital advocacy organization, how do you build consensus? And how does the community prioritize its political capital?
Thank you for that question, Dalia, and appreciate both Edward and Ahmed for speaking before me, and ISPU for putting this together. I felt like that's the hardest question that's been thrown right now. Building
Absolutely, I agree. It is the hardest question.
With our crew. I'll tell you, the reality for us at Empower is that we work with groups on the ground that can help inform and hone in what the issues are that our communities are facing. We run our My Muslim Vote campaign, which is, decidedly and intentionally vanilla. It's nonpartisan, is very broad. Our goal and the things that we hone in on are some of the things that are tried and true in civic engagement and GOTV efforts. That social pressure that it's on our community to go out to vote. If we've seen other communities vote, why is it that our community may not be? We've drawn in, actually, when we looked at the ISPU poll that y'all just released this year, we noticed that y'all pulled out the 18 to 49 age demographic, and women were less likely to vote in midterm election years. So we literally turned around with our team. That's the demographic that we started targeting and started engaging and talking to folks on the phone. We built into our script, just being very honest that, in midterm years, studies show that a Muslim voter turnout is really low in these groups. So it's our responsibility.
Happy that you did that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for sharing that.
When we looked at, recommendations for the community, we're like, okay, this is where Empower lives. This is where we can play our part in the work that our community is doing. So, we use a little bit of that social pressure based on the numbers that we're seeing, or just, the reality that on the ground, we've done a lot of mobilization work, Empower, Engage, CAIR, Jetpack, Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition in the last 4, 5, 6 years to mobilize our communities. Now our next step was thinking through, why we're hitting some of those same apathetic tendencies. I just hopped on a phone bank with my volunteers last night, and somebody on the phone just told me that, oh, if there's no Muslim running in my district, why should I turn out to vote? And, it was kind of understanding that if there's not a Muslim that they can identify with, what's the purpose for mobilizing? And so we turned back and said, or I said that, in midterm years, it's really important for our community to turn out because our numbers are lower. And then, digging a little bit deeper, how do we build that consensus? We can't build national consensus on, this, or at least we're not there yet to kind of build the 10 point policy platform, what Muslims should be organizing around with 95% certainty. But we can turn around and start asking our bases and our communities, what are the issues that are impacting you? I feel like we're, as Mohammed mentioned, that, you know, we should be reflecting on the successes and the benchmarks that we've arrived at, but we're still in the middle of this race. Like, we're still in a place where we're looking to understand how we mobilize our Muslim community nationally, if that's even like a viable outcome that we want. Or are we thinking statewide? Or are we thinking regionally? Empower, our goal has always been, you know, whenever we're working in key states or in key communities, who are the local organizations there that have a stronger bearing on the issues that are impacting that community? We may have the resources, we may have some of the skills to train folks up on doing effective phone banking or texting, or training volunteers on how to engage with voters. But we really consider ourselves successful when we're working with a partner on the ground, saying that, hey, these are the issues that we know are resonating with our base. Is that something that we can build in and run with? I'll stop there.
It is a difficult question. Thank you for tackling it so skillfully. Dr. Dallara, building on what we just heard, you head a civic organization that is based in Illinois. So we know that regional and local civic engagement is a key to engagement at the national level. Can you speak to the successful work being done in Illinois and how it is connected, how it can connect the community to the national policy space?
Great. Assalamu alaikum, and may God's peace be to each of you. Thank you, Dalia, and the ISPU team, and my colleagues for the empowering leadership in the civic justice spaces across the nation. We're each telling our story, and our story is stronger, Dalia, when we corroborate it with the research and data that ISPU provides us. And we utilize that data all the time when speaking to public officials, when speaking to voters, et cetera, to get them engaged. So to answer your question about that national, regional, local collaboration, we know national level is important. And all three of my colleagues who spoke before me have national organizations. But we also know in reality, America is a federation of 50 pretty independent, stubborn states. And we're learning this more and more as we talk about our political divides and our social divides, and even the foods we eat and the accents we have across our nation, right? So we know we are independent and that we are organizations on our own. So what is the ideal strategy for our community as we gain empowerment in the space? And it really is a combination of strong national groups such as Engage, Empower, MPAC, CAIR, et cetera, plus the empowered and autonomous states and regional civic coalitions, possibly at the top 15 states that are the most populated in the US. If we can get to those, that would be amazing, right? And I'm going to give you examples of what that literally looks like in a national, regional collaboration in the work that we've done over the last 5 years. So let's start with voters, right? Engage, empower, help us identify national voter databases. Gula is a master at like slicing that van and the data of the different voters. The Muslim Civic Coalition in Illinois, Michigan, Virginia, we're all being provided these resources by these national organizations. But on the ground, we're organizing. We're making sure that Jummah tables are there. We're making sure that every event, whether it is a food pantry event or whether it is a gala, make sure there's a table there, make sure that there's events, make sure that the social media presence across the state is strong. So that again, we have the national resources, but the local expertise of who to connect with. I'm going to talk about policy. MPAC, Engage, Empower, CAIR are also national organizations that focus on policies that actually affect all of us, both in this nation and sometimes foreign policy. But regional organizations like ours and others work to pass state laws that are critical to all of us at these levels, right? So what we are in regional organizations are we're the web. We're creating the web across the nation of work being done. And when a national political organization or civic organization or policy organization needs us to come together, we pull up to a dot. And we are one community. And that would be like a fabulous way as we move forward into the future of staying close to the ground as webs and pulling up as a dot every time something needed all our attention at the same time. That would be great civic justice collaboration, and we're getting there. I'm going to give a third example, research. ISPU coordinated a statewide report for Illinois. As soon as we released that historic report, 6 other states said, we need to have that. Well, we'd codified our work, Dalia, with all the meetings we'd had. We know the timeline of what it takes to do it. We know who you have to reach out to get the deep engagement that we got in Illinois. And now we're helping build capacity in other organizations across the nation to do that work, to get research. Imagine again, the top 15 states in the nation have their independent data on their own Muslim community, which they can use with healthcare providers, public officials, businesses, etc. And then ISPU can aggregate those 15 states' data to a national level. And that's the power of the national and the local. The last example I'll give you is capacity building. And that is, for example, America Indivisible, great fellowship on Public Leaders Council. In Illinois, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to just add to their status and add to their curriculum. We contribute to both the curriculum of the piece, but then we source the public officials that go into that fellowship. So right now, 20% of the fellows in the PLC for 2022 come from Illinois. We're also sourcing from Michigan. We're sourcing from Wisconsin. We're sourcing from Indiana. And now we're building, again, this national fellowship of public officials, and they're coming from the states because the states know who should be going to these fellowships. So this type of national or regional collaboration is what will create both municipal and federal level power for all our residents across the nation. And I just wanted to share my screen and say that this is all also on our website, but like, again, telling the American Muslim story. This one pager is downloadable. It's ISPU data, and then it's the 400 years of Muslims in America. Download this, print this, and put it on your fridge, because if we don't know our own story, how can we share it with someone else? And then the scope that we work on is all of the holistic way of doing civic justice. And that's what we need to take a look at both the national and the local level. Civic justice requires a holistic approach of multiple, we call them puzzle pieces that all fit, but no one organization can do this anymore. I'll ask Edward, Gula, or Ishraq, none of us could do it alone. And so specializing is critical, and then having the national and regional partnership is critical. You know, quickly, we talked about those states. Who would those states be? Look at these states. We started with Illinois because it has the largest per capita Muslim population in the nation, according to our report and the work we did with ISPU. But imagine if we'd gone also, as we are going, into these other states and collaborating with communities there. And then add Georgia to this, add Wisconsin to this, add Ohio to this, and imagine what we've got in this. So please reach out to us if you are already doing civic work and you want to do it in a holistic scope. We'd like to connect you with ISPU and engage and CAIR and empower in the different ways that we are doing it in the different puzzle pieces. But this is an exciting opportunity. Like you said, the last 5 years, I loved Gula's list of our accomplishments. Imagine what the next 5 years is going to look like.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful summary and very informative of, about how the local, the regional, and the national can work together. We are going to have a few minutes for questions. So if you would like to submit questions, please do so in the Q&A, not in the chat because they're very difficult to find there. So please in the Q&A, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So the first one I'll tackle, do you think there's a social desirability bias when it comes to the question on voter registration? Would the panelists working on increasing voter registration agree with the promising numbers presented in the poll? So I'll just start on the question of social desirability, because it's a question we get often. It's, it's something that survey researchers always have to grapple with and deal with. And that is the reason we compare year to year and across groups, right? Because the social desirability will be similar year to year and across groups. So what we find is maybe those absolute numbers may not be accurate in any group, or slightly, overstated. But what we do know is that comparatively, Muslims are now similar to groups like Protestants and Catholics, and we know that there has been a steady rise year to year. So that is something that cuts across or eliminates the impact of social desirability. But I'd love to hear anyone else commenting on the second part around, do you agree with these numbers? Do you think these promising numbers are real?
Well, Illinois, you had talked about 81% are registered across the nation, and we had a slightly higher number in Illinois. We actually had about the percentage that were either going to register or are already registered was just above 90%. And I think, yes, certainly, there is the bias of those who engage to continue to engage, et cetera. But again, as to Gula and to the others that spoke about this, it is also the work that's being done on the ground that's really making a difference. Let's just say we're increasing the bias of people who want to be part of this because we're making it accessible. We're making it interesting. We're making voting important and easy by the work that we're doing. We have legislators that say, my goodness, you all started filling out witness slips. Yeah, we sponsored some bills into law. And guess what? When we say the Muslim community sponsored this bill that is good for all Americans or all Illinoisans or all Wisconsinites, then everyone wants to be part of that. And they fill out witness slips. And now every year we have organizations and communities and residents even who are like, so when are our next bills coming out so that we can fill out more witness slips? Because everyone submitting that they're want this law or want this bill. Census and redistricting every 10 years. Now we're making it important. We're making it critical. We're making it exciting. And excuse me, but I guess we're kind of making civic justice sexy now. And so it's getting work done.
Great, thank you.
If I could just share a few thoughts on this. So
yeah,
I think the concern that people responding to a poll and then saying what they think they're supposed to say, is a real concern. Yes, of course I'm registered to vote. I'm planning to vote, right? Of course, that's for anyone, Muslim, non-Muslim, anyone. And the fact is, we have seen in recent years that polling, as important as it is, as informative as it is, it's not foolproof, right? So there's a lot of science that goes into this. And even when the question is very simple, are you voting for Biden or Trump? The numbers turned out to be off, right? Clinton or Trump, right? So it's not an exact science, but the thing that is important, I think, and that is clear, number one, are trends, right? The trends in the number of people reporting that they are registered to vote, number one. Number two, I still believe the polling numbers are accurate insofar as a significantly larger number of Muslims are registered to vote now than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Is it exactly 80% or 89%, 90%? Okay, that, it's not exact because we don't even know for sure how many Muslims there are in America, right? Even that's an estimate. So to say the percentage of people, it's always a bit of an estimate, but the polling is still very clear. ISPU's poll makes this clear. Other polling makes it clear. The numbers have gone up. A significant, and I believe a clear majority of Muslims, a supermajority, are registered to vote. But I still think there are a lot more people that we need to register to vote. And so I don't think we should rest and assume, all right, we got everyone. I still think there are a lot more people out there. I don't know what percentage it is, but they're out there. And again, there are all sorts of reasons why they may not be registered to vote, feeling there's no one to vote for, both parties are nuts. I mean, those are all things that people can address by getting involved and making their voice heard, or even running for office, right? You don't have to take your ball and go home and assume there's nothing you can do. You can get involved and try to support the people that you want to see being elected. So again, I think there are people out there, maybe more than we know, that aren't registered, but I think the news is still mostly good, but there's more work to be done.
Thank you.
Hey,
well said.
And I'll add this one brief point where I actually do 100% agree with it, mainly because, so at Mgage, we do have access to the actual voter file in the states that we do operate in. And we operated in 12 states in 2020, along with the organizations that are also on this call. And with having access to that voter file, we do have a name match algorithm or a likely Muslim list, where that's where we do a lot of our outreach and our organizing. And so we also saw, according to the data that we have, an increase, a 27% increase in the electorate between 2016 and 2020. And so when I start to see, and I know, of course, that name match algorithm is not perfect because it does not count a large number of our African-American brothers and sisters and or our white brothers and sisters who do end up reverting or do not have a quote unquote Muslim sounding name. So there is a large contingency of folks from our community that is missing. But to just look at the trend of growth, we do see, or we do feel like that is the case. But I'll even take it a step further, where to me, voter registration is just the first step. And so what we also saw from 2016 to 2020 is that increase in Muslim voter turnout. You saw it in the midterms, you also saw it in 2020. And so not only do you see that increase in voter turnout, you also see an increase in folks who are requesting absentee ballots. You see it, an increase in folks who are voting early. And with the same data that we did, and we do have a data report that we did put out, where we talked about the electorate that we did have, particularly in Florida and in Texas. We saw that 88% of likely Muslim voters came out and voted absentee or early. And so just looking at the steps that it takes to vote, as my brother Edward had mentioned earlier, it's not, they didn't just register, they actually came out and voted, or they requested their absentee ballots, or they went and voted early and they made the plan. And so it's the whole process. What we saw was like an increase in the whole process of the action of voting. That really, when reading this poll, we definitely see on the ground and definitely appreciate and use.
Thank you so much. And just in summary, social desirability is always an issue in any survey, but that's why you have comparison groups and then comparison across time. So you at least know the trend, the movement, and it is definitely growing, even if those exact numbers may be hard to estimate. Another question that I'd like to pose to the panel, what, according to the panel, what impacts did COVID-19 have on Muslim civic engagement?
I don't mind jumping in, just because, Empower Change was already a digital advocacy organization leading into 2020. So when we were thinking of how are we going to be doing our civic engagement GOTV efforts, what we already had kind of envisioned a plan of digital engagement through webinars, through digital tools, et cetera. What we ended up scrapping was our in-person work. And so for sure, I think with COVID, at least in 2020, what we ended up realizing is that we were in a position to kind of pivot and, take all our trainings online, take all our GOTV efforts, either through virtual phone banking, text banking, which of course, I know CAIR, Mgage, and the Muslim Civic Coalition and several organizations have been doing. We realized that was a way to engage a lot of folks that wanted to get involved and take action. And, there was a way to continue to take action through election day and beyond. Because if we're going to be continuing to do virtual engagement, there's a way that we have to think about how are we going to engage folks outside of that election year? Are we providing an organizing training? Are we providing folks tools? I see that there's an anonymous attendee asking a very specific community organizing question that, we tried mobilizing for a certain meeting. That meeting was shut down by the power brokers there. And so we started thinking, how are we kind of providing and giving folks the resources and tools for folks to, understand what effective organizing is, how to understand that, if there's a power play being pushed on your community, how do we respond to that? So we made a pivot towards the digital. What we did recognize is that, we may have lost out on capturing a certain segment of our community. I remember prior to the pandemic, I was doing in-person trainings out on the East Coast. That was the last series of in-person trainings we had done. And then we just transitioned to doing virtual trainings and just reflecting the in-person trainings that we had done were at mosques. So there were, older stakeholders involved in those trainings. Earlier this year, we did our Changemaker training series, which again was organizing one-on-one. How do we get people to stay engaged beyond elections? And it was largely a younger demographic. So we recognize that, you know, there's through digital organizing, we do have access to reach a lot of folks, but we're recognizing that we may be missing out on a certain part of our community as well.
Some examples of Ishraq in the reach, like when we were passing the first ever Muhammad Ali holiday law, we had a panel discussion on why this is critical, you know, panel discussion of thought leaders in the space. We had almost 1,000 people across the nation register for this event. Pre-pandemic, it would have been an event in person, probably, you know, in town, and it would have been maybe Facebook Live. Right. But now with 1,000 people who registered via Zoom to join this and to come in person, because we did it as a hybrid, and then the thousands that viewed it on Facebook Live in all of the different organizations that shared it at Facebook Live, the reach was incredible and it was national. And so we're seeing this over and over again. I also want to not discount aunties on WhatsApp groups that are passing out information on how to find out if you're registered to vote or not. I want to, you know, highlight Black and Brown communities that, again, may not have accessibility, but have a phone and they get texts and they get Facebook and they get other sources like that. Refugee communities that may not have the transportation to get to a site, but again, have a WhatsApp group and have an opportunity to get on a phone call, et cetera. So certainly the challenges are there from the pandemic, but there are opportunities and I think we're learning to capitalize on them.
Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but I want to first thank our thoughtful panelists. This was an incredibly important conversation. And to all of you who've joined us this afternoon. Your feedback is very important to us. So if you could take a few minutes to fill out the poll that we just launched. And as you do that, I'll give you a couple more things I'd like you to walk away with. A link to the research is shared in the chat and will also be emailed in a follow-up email. So look for that. And just a reminder, there are more webinars in the series that will dive deep into different topics covered in this report, including climate change, and that's the next one, and other topics. Please mark your calendar for the next one, and that's going to be November 3rd at 3 p.m. And that webinar will be on climate change. Please continue to be ambassadors for the facts and share our resources with your network as well as the things that you learned today. A follow-up email will be sent next week with resources relevant to this topic. Please share with those who are interested in your network. And thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.